Peter.
Yeah, good morning, and thanks for taking a couple of minutes to do a little quick mini deep dive into the 1031 rulings. This is, the coronavirus has changed everybody's plans. Like whatever your plans are that you started 2020 with, they are different now, and that has impacted people who are in 1031 exchanges or thinking about doing 1031 exchanges. So first of all, just
Very
can
true.
you give us a little background? When has the government, when has the government changed the 1031 rules in the past? Like, what's the
Sure,
precedence? What's the precedence to this, so people get a little bit of the flavor?
sure. So people who are familiar with 1031 exchanges know that once you sell, you're on some very tight time frames. You have to buy within 180 days, and you have to identify the property you're going to buy within 45 days. And those dates are pretty much set in stone before really two occurrences. One is being called up to active military duty and stationed in an active combat zone. That's
Hmm.
happened to me once in my 20-year career.
Hmm.
The other, far more common, which is what we're going to talk about today, is when there's a federally declared disaster. Then the government provides an extension.
Yeah. So when has this happened? Recently. I know it happened after 9/11 in New York. Does it happen regionally when there's natural disasters and stuff like this?
Yeah, it actually happens quite frequently. So what makes this federally declared disaster different, historic, if you will, is that it's for the whole United States. Federally declared disasters are, generally speaking, for those counties in Florida affected by a hurricane, those counties in California affected by a wildfire. So they're very regional, they're local. Obviously, when we have big storms, you can have multiple states being affected,
Right.
but it's always a region. So many times a year, we get an extension for affected taxpayers.
For certain reasons. So this isn't something completely out of the ordinary for people who may be concerned about, who just want to take a very conservative approach. This isn't something that the IRS doesn't do often when there are natural disasters, which I would put the virus in that category.
Yeah, not only that, the IRS has a ruling out there that explains the extension that you're going to get. The only thing that really makes this different is the rulings always contemplate a physical damage, a
Hmm.
storm, a tornado, a fire. Doesn't contemplate a pandemic. And also what makes this ruling different is they deviated from what they've always done in the past
Okay,
for,
so let me stop you there, just so we kind of start from flat ground. What did the IRS say relative to people who were doing exchanges during the time of coronavirus?
sure. So the IRS basically has a ruling out there. It's Revenue Procedure 2018-58. I've been saying it so often lately, I should have it off the top of my head. But Section 17 controls that. Now, unfortunately, what they did was when the IRS issues the notice, and that's kind of like if you think about the act that you need to get the extension. So the IRS issued notice 2020-23. And what they did, though, even though they referenced this revenue procedure that is supposed to give the extension, they used odd language, different language, if you will, that caused an ambiguity, and different tax professionals to say there's two competing views of how many days extra people involved in a 1031 exchange will receive.
Okay, so explain the. Okay, so what are the two views?
Sure. Okay. So the one that historically, I've been doing this 21 years. Normally, when there's a federally declared disaster, you get an extra 120 days in which to purchase your replacement property, and an extra 120 days to identify property if you're still within your 45-day period or your property was substantially damaged by the hurricane. And that's been out there in a ruling, and it's just waiting for a storm to happen, and the IRS says, this is what you're going to get.
So that's their canned response that they take off the shelf and apply to natural disasters.
Right. That's a good way to put it. It's always out there.
Okay. And
What they did this time,
what happened this time?
yeah. So what happened this time is they didn't specifically mention 1031 exchanges. You see, every notice that you ever get basically says, look at Section 17 of this revenue procedure, which is specific to 1031 exchange. They didn't reference it. They just referenced the whole revenue procedure. And keep in mind, the whole revenue procedure deals with more than just 1031. So it's a little odd thinking, but it's the majority view, actually, where people said because they didn't specifically mention 1031, they just referenced the whole revenue procedure, we think the notice controls. And what the notice says is if either your 45 or 180 day time period in which to buy property falls between April 1st and July 15th, you get up until July 15th. So you don't get 120 days. If your time day falls within that April 1st to July 15th, it's extended to July 15th. So the further along you are in that time period, the less benefit you get.
Okay, so meaning if your 45-day identification period was supposed to end on May 1st, right? So your 45th day was
Right.
May 1st. You're saying that 45 days now extends till July 15th.
That's right. That's right.
And if you were supposed to close on May 1st, so your 180th day was May 1st, you now have until July 15th.
That's right. That's right. So to keep your example moving, if your 45th day was say July 10th, you
Right.
only get 5 days. If your 180th day was July 10th, you only get 5 days.
Right.
And by the way, due to what I'll call the curious language of this notice, if you sold between January 17th and February 16th, both your 45-day time period and 180-day time period fall outside of that April 1st to July 15th. You're in this no man's land. You don't get any help from this at all.
Right, and that's where the ambiguity is here.
That's one of the problems. But the other ambiguity is that there are other tax professionals saying the notice did reference the revenue procedure, and thus the revenue procedure should control. And what that means is instead of only getting till July 15th, which is much more restrictive in many cases, that taxpayers would actually get an extra 120 days to buy their property, and depending on when their 45 days falls, they may get an extra 120 days in which to identify. And that's the standard way. That's the historic way. That's the to use your language, the canned response of the IRS.
Mm-hmm. So
but it's been deviated.
Right. So you have some of the tax professionals reading this according to the July 15th dates that we just talked about, and then you have other ones who are going back to what is normally applied to natural disasters and hurricanes, which is you get an extra 120 days.
That's right. That's correct.
How do you think this resolves?
Yeah, well, the attorney who authored the notice, and again, not looking to cast aspersions, they're the Treasury Department, of which the IRS is part, trying to save the economy, right? They got a lot of things on their plate.
They have a lot on their hands
some
right
things
now.
Together. So in case somebody at the IRS is looking at this, not casting aspersions, but they kind of dropped the ball a little. And the attorney who wrote this notice spoke to the ABA Tax Committee about a week or so ago, and she admitted, yeah, there's some ambiguity here that needs to be cleaned up. So we've literally been waiting every single day to see if the IRS issues that notice. I personally, on behalf of my company, wrote an email to that author, and the Trade Association for All Qualified Intermediaries wrote a letter to Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, saying, this is what we think it should be.
Yeah.
Please clarify.
Well, during this time, obviously so much has changed. And if you're trying to do a transaction, we see this on the transactional side ourselves, financing has changed, pricing has changed. In many parts of the market, they're doing, you're essentially rediscovering pricing. All property types, we're trying to see, who paid in April, who's going to pay in May.
Right.
That's going to impact pricing in certain ways, the lending environment, as I said. So all of these things, if you're are the ground is moving, and if you're trying to do an exchange, it sure makes it a little more complicated. It could be an opportunity because for sellers who are looking to actually transact right now, to be engaging with someone who's in an exchange, um, that could be, the knight in shining armor that kind of helps solve your situation. But with some of the property dynamics changing, pricing's changing, and just being able to close the transaction. So I appreciate you giving some thought on this, and we'll post your contact information. So if people have more questions and they want to follow up with you as the expert, you can really get into the details on this type of stuff. So thanks for the conversation, Todd.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for having me on board.
Before we end, I forgot, I wanted to ask you one final question, because this always comes up, and I have my opinion on this, but I want to hear yours. Every time there's an election year, which this is, we get the question, is there a chance 1031 is going to go away? Based on everything and where we sit today, what's your opinion of that?
In order for things to change, you need agreement. And I think, unfortunately, and this is an unfortunate commentary, I don't think we've seen a more divisive electorate in recent times, and I don't see that changing regardless of who gets elected, president next. So, in order to get tax reform, which is what you need to change 1031, you need people working together. And
Right.
the unfortunate commentary is I don't see that.
Yeah.
So I think for those reasons we're safe.
Yeah, and I would just add that with all the impetus to get the economy going, taking away 1031 would dampen the number of transactions. And
I agree.
There's some business reasons to keep it in place too. So thanks for answering that last question, and
Sure.
We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks again, Peter.